right, so maybe an argument has a missing premise or a missing conclusion because the missing statement is so obvious that it would almost be insulting. It would seem condescending if we included the obvious statement in the formal expression of our argument. Okay, so that's a perfectly legit reason to leave a statement out of an argument, leave that statement unexpressed. But there are other reasons that aren't quite so innocent. One of those reasons is this: somebody's trying to get you to accept what is a bad argument for a good argument. Okay, someone's trying to make you believe that the argument they're offering you is valid when it's in fact invalid, or that it's sound when in fact it's unsound. Take a look at this argument. Only nonprofit organizations are exempt from paying taxes, so churches must be exempt. Now, at first glance, doesn't sound terribly unreasonable. Only nonprofit organizations are exempt from paying taxes, so churches must be exempt. What we want to do to be able to make a formal evaluation of this argument is we want to figure out what the missing statement is here, and then once supplied, how does the argument actually add up? How does it stack up? How can we evaluate it? Okay, so what we're going to do first is we're going to look to identify, well, what's missing? Is there a conclusion or a premise statement missing? And we see right off the bat the word so. That's a conclusion indicator telling us two things. The statement that follows it, churches must be exempt, is our conclusion. And the statement that precedes it is one of the premises. Okay, so now what I can do is I can start to translate the two statements that have been offered as a part of this argument into standard form categorical statements, because that's going to make it much easier for me to identify the missing premise. So I'm going to go scouting for terms that I can use in standard form categorical statements. And the first term I see is nonprofit organizations. And I like that term because I don't have to do anything to it to include it in a standard form categorical statement, because nonprofit organizations is a plural noun. Now I move on to the next term, exempt from paying taxes, and that's not quite so clean as nonprofit organizations, because exempt from paying taxes is not a plural noun or noun phrase, but I can make it into one. Organizations exempt from paying taxes. And then I move on to the last term of the argument, churches. Again, lucked out. Churches is a plural noun, so I can use it as the third term of my argument. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to translate this one premise statement and the conclusion into standard form categorical statements. I can see the conclusion, churches must be exempt, would translate to all churches are organization exempt from paying taxes, or all C or E. And then the premise statement, only nonprofit organizations are exempt from paying taxes, has an important word in it. In terms of translating the statement, it has the word only. And I know that whatever follows only is going to serve as the predicate term of my standard form categorical statement. So I've got to come up with a statement that has nonprofit organizations as its predicate term. And that leaves me with all organizations exempt from paying taxes are nonprofit organizations. Bummer. So now what I want to do is I want to look really carefully at the terms of this argument to see which of them have been used 2 times and which have been used only once. And when I do that, I can see really clearly here that the major term of the argument, the predicate of the conclusion, has appeared up here in this first premise that's part of the argument. And so that tells me that this, the E term doesn't appear anymore in this argument, but the minor term C and the middle term M have only appeared once each. And they have to appear 2 times in a valid categorical syllogism. So now I know that the statement that I'm looking for, the missing statement, is a premise statement about C and N. Okay? Now, there's 2 possibilities here. Because my conclusion statement is an all statement and my one premise is an all statement, I know that the missing statement has to also be an all statement. Because what rule number 4 says is if you have a negative conclusion, you also have to have a negative premise. But I don't have a negative conclusion. So I know that I can't have a negative premise because a negative premise would require there to be a negative conclusion, and I don't have that. So I know that the premise that I'm looking for is an all statement or a some statement, but I also know that none of the valid argument forms that have all as an all statement as its conclusion has any some statement as a premise. So I know that my missing premise statement is either all C are N or all N are C. Either all churches are nonprofit organizations or all nonprofit organizations are churches. And I know it's not this second option because it's not the case that all nonprofit organizations are churches. There's plenty of nonprofits. Humboldt County's full of them that are not churches but are nonprofit organizations. So I know the missing premise is all C or N. So there's my missing premise. And now we have the argument in its full form. And I can look at it symbolically and refer back to what the terms refer to, or I can write it all out in not ordinary language, but I can write out the terms in their complete wording. Okay, so to test this argument for validity, now I'm going to identify the distributed terms. I'm going to identify the distributed terms of the argument. This argument has 3 A statements, and all A statements distribute their subject terms. So E is distributed, C is distributed, in both the second premise and in the conclusion. And now I can start to work through those 5 rules. The first rule of categorical syllogism says that the middle term needs to be distributed at least once. N is the middle term, and it's not distributed. That means this argument is invalid. If we tried to Venn diagram this argument after marking in the premises, we would not see the conclusion statement reflected by that Venn diagram. This argument is invalid because it commits the fallacy of undistributed middle. But it was really hard to see that. I shouldn't say that. It's going to be harder to see that fact when we are looking at this ordinary language argument with that missing premise. With that premise unstated, it's harder to see that the argument is actually flawed.